I'm Shayok Kadwa from 3IE. I am a research associate there and I work on research transparency. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit about 3IE and then our research transparency policy. And then we've been working on a paper about push button replications. I'm going to talk about the results from that paper. And finally, a little bit about our recent endeavor into qualitative data. Okay, so okay, so who we are. So 3IE is a member-based international NGO. We are grant makers, producers, and standard setters for policy-relevant impact evaluation, systematic reviews, evidence gap map, evidence synthesis, and replication studies. We do a lot of capacity building, hold workshops in terms of educating people about impact evaluations, and we have all our reports and data, code, everything, we have it as in public domain, right? And we consider ourselves as the champions of global public evidence codes. Now, you see a few numbers at the end. So I'm just gonna talk to you about the impact that we have had. So we have 15 evidence gap maps. We have commissioned or worked on 50 systematic reviews. We have funded impact evaluations and systematic reviews in over 50 countries. Then the next one is we have about 50 members. We have 250 impact evaluations that have been commissioned. We have 700 systematic reviews in our repository, and we have over 5,000 impact evaluations registered in our impact evaluation repository. Okay, so last year, in April 2018, we came out with our research transparency policy. So 3IE has always been talking about research transparency, open data since its inception. We slowly moved into getting data, then codes, and we have made everything open access. But we formally recognized research transparency with the policy last year in April 2018. So the paper that I'm going to talk about is actually based on this. So it kind of shows what happened before and after the policy. So we didn't have a lot of data to do a proper pre-post, but it's mostly descriptive stats, I would say. So the highlights of the policy are purely based on research transparency things. For example, we have pre-registration, pre-analysis plans. So in terms of pre-registrations, we require pre-registrations for impact evaluations as well as systematic reviews. And then pre-analysis plans for both impact evaluations and systematic reviews. So for systematic reviews, you could consider the protocol as the pre-analysis plan, basically. And for pre-registration, you could think of the title registration as this for the systematic review. Next, we ensure that all the materials, including data and code, the data and code are in the Dataverse, the Harvard Dataverse, and all data is de-identified. The rest of the materials, like for example, reports, policy briefs, are all on our website. Okay, and then we also require appropriate citations, and we provide unrestricted access to and reuse all published research, right? So these were some of the highlights of our policy. Okay, so I'll go into the paper that we had written, and it's currently under review. So it talks about the push button replication process that we had done over the past year or so. So we had about 100 odd closed studies. So by closed studies, I mean studies which have which have been completed both administratively and financially. So all tranche payments have been made to the grantees. And so we followed this kind of a process for our replication, basically, the push button replication. So we receive data and code, then we check for all the materials, like your data, code, any like README files, etc. Then we run and debug the code. So the debugging is like minimal. So in terms of push button replication, you would want to make as the least amount of changes, basically. So so we make, and any changes we make, we communicate with the grantees to understand if they are okay with the change or not. And then if we are happy with the code and the data, then we move on to comparison of results. So we run the code, and then the results we compare with the results that are presented in the reports. So once we are happy with the comparability of it, then we do final quality checks. We again do a de-identification check. We do some spot checks, basically pick up, say, a random couple of tables and see whether the result match the log files or the, So once that is done, then we publish the data in the Harvard Dataverse, and we also archive the data and the code in an offline storage. So the publication of the data comes with the report when it's online. So 3IE has its own reports. So when the reports come online, we publish the data with it. And so this, the publication of report takes anything between 3 to 6 months from the time the report has come to us for quality assurance. Right? Okay. So in the paper, we looked at studies till 2018. So we had about 117 closed studies. And so out of those 117 closed studies, we had data and code for 74. And then 43 of the studies, we did not have data and code. So we started mandating data and code around 2010, 2011. We've always talked about public availability of data, but in our contracts, we started mandating it from 2010, 2011. So some of the things that came up when we looked into the data previously is that we had only data for 17 studies. We had code files only for 6 studies. We had some broken links for 4 studies, and some grantees did not submit their data, which were about 16 studies. So these kind of include studies that did not mandate data as well. The broken links are basically when we requested grantees to make things public, they would put it on their own website, and I think 3-4 years down the line, maybe the website doesn't exist or something happened there, right? So these studies, we classified them as not applicable for replication. So for us, the studies that could be replicated needed to have data and code. So if you compare this with some other studies, say by Gertler or, so there, these studies will be classified as applicable for replication and unable to replicate. So we have it a little bit different. So the graph here shows a cumulative replication rate. So the denominator for all of these is the 74 studies. So basically between 2013 and 2017, we had about 40% on average replication rate. And in 2018, we had a dramatic rise. So we sort of contribute, due to the research transparency policy, we had this dramatic increase. I'll talk about the numbers in the next slide as well. And in 2019, we are still working on the 2019 data. So till date, we have pushed the rate to about 61%. So this is a cumulative rate over time. So one thing to note here is that all the replications were done in 2018. So we had data and code from studies pre-2018, which were replicated in 2018. So somewhere it was pretty difficult to get data and code from some of the researchers because of the kind of time that has passed. But overall, this is the replication rate. These are the yearly replications by number. So we had comparable studies, incomplete studies, and major differences. So comparable studies, as you can see from 2017 to 2018, we had a dramatic rise from 7 to 17 studies, which is about 140%. So there were still 3 incomplete studies. So incomplete studies are studies where we received part of the code and data. So we could replicate, say, 6 out of the 10 tables that were there in the report. Studies with major differences would be where we had kind of significant differences in the estimates. So for some of these major differences studies, because the amount of time that had passed, we received data and code for published papers rather than the 3IE reports. And so there were some like changes in model specification, or the data disaggregation was different. So there were a bunch of issues that led to these major differences, right? Now this, I think, is a very important slide. So we actually tracked how much time it took for us to do all the replications. So we were a team of research assistants and associates who worked on the replication. So some of the replications were about 60 of them were done by one person. And then when we moved on, like last year, we had about 4 or 5 people who came on board to work on these replications. So one thing to note would be that a lot of the research assistants and associates we had did not have any formal knowledge of, say, Stata or R. So they were coming from sociology, or, I mean, they did not have any kind of technical knowledge in terms of coding. So we had capacity building sessions. We had 2, one specifically on Stata and R, and one on replication, the push button replication things. And so, as you can see, on average, it took us about 3 hours to do one replication. And it varied, the time varied from 2 to 6 hours. Mind you, these are studies still 2018. So in 2019, we have had some studies which we have had to go back and forth with the researchers, and that has taken a little bit more time, right? Okay, so a few lessons learned. So open data, I would say, is an ongoing process. So it cannot be just one day we come out with a policy, or we just say that, oh, we need everything, and the next day onwards, we get everything. So it's a change in culture, I guess, that we need to work towards. So policy articulation and enforcement can serve as important steps to reinforce commitment to transparency. So this is from our experience in terms of launching the policy. So when we launched the policy, we kind of ran into a lot of pushback. I'm going to talk about those in the next slide on challenges. But having a formal policy kind of helped us to tell people that, okay, see, we have a policy and this is what it is. It is to do with best practices, and it's ethical to do all these things. And so we should adhere by this policy. So we could go to them. And so what we did actually was, to all our grantees, we actually sent out a mass mailer saying that we have this policy. And yeah, so having a policy is very important. Open data begins with informed consent. Okay, so this is something that we ran into when we were looking into qualitative data. So we had not thought about it before. We had always thought that, given that we always talked about open data, the researchers in their consent forms to the IRBs will always have that kind of language that states that the data is going to be open. And so the consent form needed to be amended, basically. So some researchers had text in their consent forms which talked about, like, this data won't be shared with anybody outside. It's only for the research teams. And yeah, so these kind of languages are kind of red flag for open data. And we realized this, and currently we are working with the qualitative data repository to actually, out of Syracuse University. So they actually have default text. Even ICPSR, I think, has some default text, which we have also incorporated. And going forward, we are talking to our grantees. We are actually incorporating it in the consent forms. Yeah. Okay, conduct replications soon after a project is complete. So this is something we saw, replications or studies that had closed like in 2013, 2014. It was very difficult to get the actual data in code for the reports that we had online. Because due to the amount of time that had passed on, most of the researchers had, obviously moved on to other projects, and they did not have a copy of the code that actually replicated the report. So it would be good to do the replication as soon as you have the report, right? Build internal capacity to manage replication. So as I showed you on the time taken slide, it doesn't take much time. And from our experience, we trained people who had little to no knowledge of code and data. And so we have kind of internally done that, and it's been successful. So we believe that internal capacity building is the way forward. Some challenges, I'll quickly touch upon them. So with the policy, one big challenge that came up was our own staff. So we had to convince and talk to them about research transparency, because a lot of the people were not aware of what it is and why we are doing it. Like, for example, the verification process also added some workload on us as well in terms of our quality assurance process. And so it took some time. The internal capacity building helped. And so, yeah, so this was one of the big challenges. Reaching out to researchers for older studies and data, I already mentioned, it was the longer it took, the more difficult it became to get data. Opposition from researchers to make data open, citing that they have the data, they will make the data open when they publish it in a journal. So 3i believes that the 3i report so you publish the data with the 3i report, and yeah. So access to government data and proprietary data for verification has been very difficult. We have gone and asked, I know Marie has written to a few government officials to get the data just for replication purposes, but we haven't had much luck there. And then ownership of data. So there's a big argument about who owns the data. The researchers say that because they have collected the data, it's their data. We would say that, oh, we funded the data, it's our data. So it's unclear there. Data privacy, again, de-identification, it was a big challenge. We received a lot of identified data. We went through, some of it was done manually, but it's very difficult because some of our researchers, we don't know the context of the data. And so basically direct identifiers, you can like identify them and remove them, but indirect ones are very difficult to remove. So yeah. Last, I'll just touch upon the qualitative data project that we are doing currently. So we are moving into curation and management of qualitative data. We feel that, and the future goal is to explore a push button replication sort of something to do with qualitative data. So a few things to remember. I think everybody knows all of these things, but still I wanted to reiterate. So the language in the consent forms is very important. So this came about when we started this pilot project, and QDR asked us to look at the consent forms, and we figured out that there is language that actually doesn't make data open. So we went back and asked the grantees who were in the pilot project to actually go back to their IRBs and get it checked, right? De-identification is not it's not equivalent to informed consent. So a lot of the people came back to us saying that, okay, let's just de-identify and put the data out there, but consent is not equivalent to de-identification. Maintaining process logs, create citation for qualitative data. So creating citation is for quantitative data as well. You generate DOIs to make it better visible. Maintaining a process log, this is true for, I think, both qualitative and quantitative data. It helps people understand what you have done. Yeah, so as I was saying, the future goal is to work on a equivalent of push button replication for qualitative data. Okay, yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Hayek. We have about 5 minutes for questions and discussion.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, I'm Marcia Krause. I'm at Harvard, and I lead the Dataverse project.
Great.
So we just have several questions. First, are you planning to publish these results? Because I found it very interesting, all your replication.
The research?
The part about what the whole replication process that you did and what replicated.
Yes, so we have worked on this paper, so it's under review right now. So
okay.
It's with PLOS ONE.
Okay.
So yeah, so we'll be publishing it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I have a couple of questions related to what you presented. First, did you see any difference between the data sets that had used our code and Stata, for example, in terms of the time that it took to reproduce the results?
I mean, differences in codes?
In the difficulty or the time it took to reproduce the results, whether they used the data set had used R for the results?
So we had most of our data sets in Stata.
Okay.
So out of the 74, I think there was just one in R.
I see. You cannot compare.
Really,
you don't plan to encourage open source, using open source?
No. It just happened so that we have everything in Stata. So going forward, like for the 2019 data, we have some in Python, R.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are kind of tracking how much time. So that's why I mentioned that there are certain studies which are taking more time.
Right.
So we have like SAS, Python, and R. Yeah, we are going into those things. So maybe next year we can come up with a better metric there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the other question, you mentioned towards the end also that some researchers are a little bit resistant to make the data available because they want to publish in a paper first. Have you considered, though, that they deposit to Dataverse? I mean, we do that with other groups, that they deposit to Dataverse and they don't release it. I mean, at the time that you have the report, you can do the reproducibility because you have access during peer review of your report. So you still can replicate the result, but and it's everything. It's already tracked there, so that it doesn't become. It's a little bit harder to ask after a long time, but you don't release the data until they publish a paper, for example.
I think we have embargoed the data for 12 months maximum.
Okay.
That's all we have done. Yeah.
Okay.
So as it is, it takes about 6 months from the time we receive the report to the time it becomes public. So we go, there are 2 rounds of, I would say it's kind of similar to peer review. So we send it out to external reviewers, and we internally also review the data. And then we do the push button replication. And then, so it's a process that takes about 3 to 6 months. So yeah, so basically 12 months, I would say, is the maximum that we have done. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nona. I work for the World Bank Tech. So I'm a bit confused about the terms that we're using here. One is reproducibility and one is replicability. And I felt like they are 2 different things. Reproducible means you just replicate the table that you have in your paper, while replication means that somebody else does the similar study on some different data and then gets the same results, right? So I was a bit confused about the terms, but if you can clarify a little bit.
So it is reproducibility. So we are just verifying the results. But the term we are using for it's the push button replication. So basically you get the data and the code, and then the idea is that you just run it and it reproduces the results, right? So replication, push button replication reproduces the results. I guess that would be, but it is reproducibility, I would say. You're right there, yeah.
Maybe just to add that because of the first slide, we talked about the different types of studies we do. We also have ran several programs of doing replication studies. So that's probably where also that came up.
Yeah, so we have peer replications as well. We funded like a window on peer replication. So we had about I think we have around 20-25 peer replication studies as well. So that's where I think that term comes up, yeah. I think Fernando. Yeah.
Hi, Fernando from BITS. Thank you very much for very interesting talk and very interesting work. I'm interested in the distinction between raw and analytic data, and if you have any protocols in place to make the distinction. In particular, say that I submit that I made an impact evaluation for you, and I submit my data to you, and I gave you kind of like a final data set that is X, Y, and my do file says like regress X and Y, something like that, and somebody else gives you all the raw data, all the cleaning files, and the final. Can you distinguish both? I know it's hard, but do you have anything along those lines?
So for now, we have focused mainly on the analysis data and the analysis code. Okay. So we do receive some raw code and raw data, and most of the times the challenge is that raw data that researchers submit has like identifiers. Mm-hmm. So because of that, we have kind of stayed away from that for now, but I think in the future, we are moving towards putting in protocols where we would want to have raw data and then have the cleaning codes and then the replication, basically, like the whole thing. But as of now, we are just looking at analysis code and analysis data. Yeah.
We have time for one more, so I think I see one.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Russ Burnett with the Office of Evaluation Sciences in the U.S. General Services Administration. I'm curious, just to build on the earlier question about what falls within the scope of the replication process, just to clarify, so if there's an analysis plan available for a project, is part of the replication to check that the code faithfully implements what's in the analysis plan, or does that fall out of scope?
So we have a quality assurance process where when the study or the report is reviewed, we look at the analysis plan and we see whether it has been replicated in terms of like whatever there is in the analysis plan, whether the researcher has followed it. And so if there are any changes in the like the analysis, then it's documented in the report as well. So we don't actually go back to the analysis plan and check it with the data and code because it's already being done when we do it for the report. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
So in term, like it is getting checked basically overall. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Shayak.
Thanks.